What is a mechanism? As Jodio first properly defines it, mechanisms have power, but they're invisible to the eyes. Okay, so that's pretty vague. An invisible power could be a lot of things, right? So let's look deeper. We know that mechanisms pervade Jodio's school, one of the first real settings that we see Jodio acting in. We see Jodio and Usagi do a drug deal right in front of the US president and founder of the school, William McKinley, an early demonstration that mechanisms act in defiance of an established order. Jodio even jokes about this to Usagi. McKinley even shows up again for a panel when Usagi finds the drugs in the drain pipe. Jodio's opening monologue also underscores the idea that although mechanisms fall below established law, they can be more just than the establishment itself. He says, "Even if we don't obey the power called law, mechanisms of trust keep one safe." So what we can gather from the evidence of Chapter 1, which has told us that mechanisms operate in spite of power and perhaps as a truer form of protection, is that mechanisms are clearly a method of rebellion against the established order. So now that we're familiar with mechanisms, the second question is, what are stands? Well, this is an easy one. The very first page of the JOJOLands tells us. Powers that have forms and shapes, but are invisible, they are called stands. They exist all over, and always have, but they are simply unseen by those that do not try to see them. A mangaka. Immediately, this sticks out because it sounds remarkably similar to Jodio's definition of mechanisms. So I think we can agree that stands and mechanisms are explicitly connected, evidenced by the similarity of the two definitions coming from the same opening chapter that sets the two ideas up. Taking the similarity further, I will argue that the establishment, taking the form of a collection of civil servant stand users, among other forms, is a symbol of the absurd, an idea that courses through the JOJOLands, starting at chapter 13, and exists subtly before then. Stands and mechanisms, then, are our protagonist's method of reconciling with the absurd, revealing humanity's persistent ability to find purpose despite the apparent meaninglessness of life and society. Okay, so we found that mechanisms are forms of rebellion against the establishment. Now I want to take this idea further and say that Araki crafts mechanisms to be forms of rebellion against the irrationality of the establishment. I think it would be quite boring if the enemy of the JOJOLands was just the government. Here, with the irrationality of the establishment, is the point where the absurd ties in and opens up more complexity for the role the government plays in the JOJOLands. In a highly influential 1971 paper, published in the Journal of Philosophy, NYU professor of philosophy and law emeritus Thomas Nagel argues that something is absurd when it includes a conspicuous discrepancy between pretension or aspiration and reality. Put simply, something is absurd when its expected function is overtly opposed to its actual function. Nagel gives the example of your pants falling down whilst you're being knighted. In that case, the expectation of the knighting was a very formal and regal procession, but the reality was evidently very silly. So why do I bring this up? What does any of this have to do with the JOJOLands? Well, when you take a look at the established order of the JOJOLands world, it becomes clear that every encounter with the establishment, which takes many forms, is completely absurd. From the very first scene of the JOJOLands, we see that the police, who are expected to protect and serve our communities, abuse their power to pull over the completely innocent Dragona and horrifically assault them. So the discrepancy between expectation and outcome here couldn't be more severe, making it absurd, to say the least. And this pattern permeates the JOJOLands. a public library being controlled by a private corporation, schoolmates turning into terrorizers, and in the most recent chapter, a lawyer, firefighter, and cop all coming together to support not the people, but an unruly CEO. So in almost every major instance of the establishment in the JOJOLands, the establishment behaves in a way that is absurd through not just a failure to deliver on their pretension, but acting in a way that is diametrically opposed to it. So, I think we can firmly conclude that, at the moment, the main antagonist of the JOJOLands is not just Howler, but all of the infrastructure in place acting to support them. Now, I think this makes our protagonist's fight against them much more meaningful, as our antagonist is not just rich guy who is bad, rather, it is the societal forces that enable the rich to exist and behave badly. So, that's pretty cool. But what's even cooler is how our protagonists fight back against this force. The protagonists of the JOJOLands use stands and mechanisms, which will prove to be very similar forces, to reconcile with the absurd. Let's go back to the opening scene of the JOJOLands, where Dragona and Jodio are faced with crooked cops. We previously established that scenario as an important symbol of the absurdity of the establishment. Quite simply, Jodio and Dragona use their stands to fight back, meaning that from the very beginning of the JOJOLands, the push and pull of stands and crooked officials exists. Also, in the coda to the scene, we see Dragona using their stand to be a bit of a fraudster by changing their ID and license plate number with smooth operators. Obviously, they have to do this to get away with their attack on the cops in a logistic sense, but it also underscores how stands create their own mechanisms of justice outside of the bounds of the law. What I'm trying to say here is you can't legally assault a cop, but with the use of a stand in a situation where that assault is pretty much needed, you pretty much can get away with it, which is awesome. Now, where this idea of stands and mechanisms as forms of justice against a misbehaving establishment gets really interesting is in the flashback to the Joestar siblings' childhood. Chapter 13 opens with a quote reminiscent of the opening page of the JOJOLands itself. While they may be unseen, stands can exist anywhere and at any time. Followed up with, "This is the day those two first became aware of theirs." So immediately, we can understand that stands are intimately tied to this memory, which will be important in a bit. On page 12, after Dragona accidentally hits their classmate with a volleyball, the whole class laughs along, Dragona included. This leads one to believe that they're all laughing with Dragona and shaking off the mistake. But Araki immediately cuts to Dragona being slammed in the face by the girl they hit in an act of violent retribution. So through the paneling of this page, Araki instills that sense of the absurd, that discrepancy between the white background and lighthearted expectation in the top of the page and the graphic violence and dark background of the bottom half of the page. Of course, the same applies to the even more graphic following scene in which Dragona survives an SA. I'm not going to get into the scene in detail, but of course it serves the same thematic function with an even more serious tone, and is a further attack on Dragona's identity. Keep this in mind as we move on. As we venture deeper into the backstory, we can find how stands and absurdity are fundamentally connected as opposing forces. Jodio, unable to bear Dragona's tormentors going unpunished, decides to take matters into his own hands. He waits for Dragona's schoolmates to file into the bus, then lights it on fire and traps the students and bus driver in it while watching them burn. Curiously, Jodio only spares them from death because a bird flies into the bus, after which he takes out November Rain, although it was not named at the time, to put out the fire, perhaps revealing his deep contempt for humanity that can only be stopped by such an innocent being. We then move into an incredibly vulnerable scene between Dragona and Jodio, Araki's potent intimacy communicating the importance of the moment. Dragona condemns Jodio's act, but ultimately thanks him. They could finally sleep at night without the violent nightmares of their assault. It is in this moment of reflection on the absurdity of what had occurred to Dragona and their schoolmates that the siblings formally earn their stands, Smooth Operators and November Rain. The development of their stands as a direct response to Dragona's sexual assault and Jodio's attack on the perpetrators is key, as it highlights that the sibling stands were born out of an attempt to respond to the absurdity of their lives. For Dragona, their purpose is to get stronger and be truer to themselves with smooth operators, which we see in the seminal moment repairing their breasts, a piece of foreshadowing of their later femininity. Jodio's newfound purpose, however, is different. It is of course the development of November Rain, the ability that allowed him to get justice for Dragona, although violently. So the siblings have a key difference in their responses to the absurd, communicated through the contrasting purposes of their stands, which opens up nuance and flaws in Jodio's character. These differences we shall analyze in the next part of this video. For now, I want to talk about the lava rock. So the lava rock is clearly a mechanism, right? Rohan even tells us pretty explicitly in chapter 5. If you handle that lava rock with care, such a mechanism will gradually become yours. As we established in the intro, a mechanism isn't all that different from a stand. The lava rock, after all, essentially has a stand ability that attracts all things valuable. Just as stands were tied to the absurd in the flashback, the lava rock is as well. When Charming Man explains how he is unable to search for his brother, he says, "Whenever I try to investigate it, for some reason, some aspect of society gets in my way. Police, the mountain rangers, the law. It's like society as a whole is going out of its way to obstruct me from searching for my brother." And the key here is what Usagi responds with. He says, "What? That's absurd." In accordance with the similarity of stands and mechanisms, the mechanism of the lava rock is also used as a response to the irrational establishment, a symbol of the absurd. In this same chapter, Meryl May devises a plan for the gang to use the rock to make Howler's bank accounts, mountain, land, company, everything ours. And of course, as of now, the lava rock is doing exactly that, showing how mechanisms, similar to stands, are tools against the absurdity of the establishment. In this case, the ridiculous control that Howler Co. holds over public officials and pretty much all of society. So far, we have established that the irrationality of the establishment is what makes it a symbol of the absurd, and that stands and mechanisms are similar in the sense that they respond to this absurdity. But what does it all mean? What theme does Araki communicate through the use of stands and mechanisms in response to the absurd? And what does that reveal about the human condition? These will be the central questions of this part of the video. Okay, so Dragona and Jodio deal with the absurd in different ways, as we established by the difference in the development of their stands. Through these differing uses in stands, much is revealed about their character, which will draw us closer to the themes of the JOJOLands. To understand Jodio's flaws, it's important to establish how they contrast with Dragona's more careful methods of interacting with the absurd, which we will now get into. Back in chapter 13, Dragona narrates from the present, reflecting on her sexual assault as neither good nor evil, but absurd. They describe how the event had nothing to do with the environment it took place in. The absurd attacks indiscriminately. Dragona continues, saying, "The assault of the absurd is an extremely important event in your life, despite you having no responsibility for it happening whatsoever." So, in other words, Dragona plays their own game, lives their own life, despite the absurd, in this case, a group of schoolmates attacking their gender identity both physically and mentally, trying to take that option away from them. Dragona's narration supports this, as they mention that the absurd will always test one's resolve to stay true to themselves, and there is no way to predict how or when this attack can come. Only when it does, one must be strong enough to bear it and reconcile with it. And Dragona does exactly this after their schoolmates assault them. By embracing their feminine identity, despite the absurd forces trying to take it away from them, Dragona properly uses their stand to rebel against the absurd. Jodio, on the other hand, is unable to let go of his past, leading him to not being able to play his own game. Rather, he plays by the rules of the absurd. In other words, he lets it get the best of him. Again, in Dragona's chapter 13 narration, they describe how the absurd might eventually corrupt Jodio if he can't let go of his scorn for it. They say, "There are hearts that are destroyed for the absurd. My little brother Jodio didn't utter a word about it, but I can't just let this go." If you can't let it go, does that mean you're just going to resign yourself to your heart being destroyed? And Dragona would be right in the sense that Jodio does let his heart get destroyed by the absurd, as we see a recurring preoccupation with the absurd throughout the JOJOLands. In that moment when Usagi calls Charming Man's hunt for his brother absurd, Jodio repeats it out loud. Araki's art here is very dramatic, highlighting that dark and pensive mood from Jodio, of course to underscore the prevalence of Jodio's painful memories in the present. This same dynamic occurs in chapter 16, in relation to the congressman's daughter being caught up in Howler's attack. Paco says, "I'd really like to do something to help her. It's just so absurd." Jodio is completely separated from the group when Paco says this, highlighting his unique struggle with the absurd. This is further emphasized by the next panel, presenting a dark background and close-up on Jodio's eyes. Then the narrator, most likely describing Jodio's thoughts, repeats our big word, absurd. Now Araki using the narrator to drop this thought suggests its importance to the story, being above a regular thought bubble that usually moves the story along. In other words, this is not a throwaway line, it can't be interpreted like that. Rather, it's a moment that constructs Jodio as a boy deeply entrenched in the absurdity of his life. So with all of this evidence of Jodio playing by the rules of the absurd, instead of living his own life like Dragona, we can gather that Jodio's flaw is letting his absurd past inhibit his ability to find a proper sense of self in his life. This lack of self, perhaps, is reflected in his motivation to become super rich. Araki crafting Jodio to desire material wealth likely stems from his unstable past that he still hasn't been able to let go of, driving him to want money to finally provide him a sense of security. Of course, wanting security in one's life is definitely not a character flaw, only it is coming from a flawed place from Jodio, a place that seems to fill a hole with money rather than self, which is why I think he's such an interesting and complex character to analyze. Finally, I think we could find the solution to Jodio's central flaw, that is, being too preoccupied with the absurdity of his past, back in Thomas Nagel's 1971 paper. In the paper, Nagel condemns Camus' position in the myth of Sisyphus, where he says, in relation to Sisyphus' divine torture, that there is no fate that can be surmounted by scorn. Now, Camus' view that one can escape the absurdity of their lives by holding it with scorn is very similar to Jodio's dark determination to never let go of what the bullies did to Dragona, or the unjust firing of his father. He responds to all of these phenomena with violence. The problem, though, is that when one tries to attack the absurdity of something that has happened in the past, they are screaming into the dark void of the universe that has always been indifferent to their struggles. This anger does nothing to address the absurd within oneself, and as Nagel aptly states, this will not make our lives unabsurd, but it will lend them a certain nobility. This seems to me romantic and slightly self-pitying. So rather than treating the absurd as this alien thing needed to be heroically defeated, Nagel argues that absurdity is one of the most human things about us, a manifestation of our most advanced and interesting characteristics. In other words, the absurd isn't something to be held with scorn as Jodio does, but something to be accepted like Dragona. So all in all, a theme of the JOJOLands to take away is that when we are confronted by an unjust and absurd world, we can't preoccupy ourselves with it and let it dominate us. Rather, we must act to change it, and ourselves, for the better. Whether it be a relationship to one's past or an interaction with a public institution, we must play our own game to improve it, never letting the struggle consume us. I believe this philosophy belongs to Dragona, who, despite being steeped in the most brutal attacks against them, nevertheless resolves to become a stronger and more confident version of themselves.